This is the second session of the Peace Research Colloquium, which is organized by swisspeace with support from the Institute for Political Science and the Graduate School of Social Sciences. We have a cool lineup of speakers over the course of this semester, and we're really happy that Philipp Schulz came all the way from Bremen to speak to us about a really exciting and innovative research agenda about taking love and care seriously in armed conflict. We're really curious to hear what this is all about. So thank you very much. As I mentioned, Philipp Schulz is from the University of Bremen and has done really exciting research in the past on the concept of vulnerability and agency, in particular survivors of male survivors of sexual violence in Uganda, and critical research that contributes to our reflections about what we're doing in this field of peace and conflict research. So thank you for coming, and we're also really excited to have a great discussant today who comes from our ranks at swisspeace, Anna Antonakis, who is a gender senior program officer at swisspeace and also has an academic background in political science, has worked on transitional justice in Tunisia and media political transformations, and obviously has, I'm sure, a lot of insights on this question of love and care from the gender perspective. And thank you so much for agreeing. So we will, as always, give you about half an hour to present your thoughts and your research, and then Anna will give some reflections, questions and answers, or questions. And then we will go into Q&A. That's why I said answers. So please participate, ask questions, and we can have a discussion. Same as for the folks on Zoom. I'll see whether I manage with the sound. If not, write the questions in the chat, but definitely put the raise hand function if you have a question later on. Yeah, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for these kind introductions and for the invitation. I'm really excited to be here and experience some spring and sunshine. It's been snowing and we had some hail in Bremen earlier this week, so it's a much needed change of scenery for me. Thank you also to Anna for being here to discuss. I'm really looking forward to hearing your thoughts, and thanks for everyone who's attending here and online. I'm really looking forward to be able to think with you today and to learn from your questions and from the discussions that we're going to have. I want to use this opportunity to share with you some thoughts and ideas about a new research project on centering love and care in peace and conflict studies. The project is in collaboration with my dear friend and colleague Roxani Cristalli at the University of St. Andrews, and it will begin in June this year with funding from the German Research Foundation and the UK Arts and Humanities Research Council. And in the project, we want to explore how taking love and care seriously can offer us new insights for understanding conflict-affected communities' lived realities, to tell what the anthropologist Caroline Nordstrom would call a different kind of war story. This, our overarching argument, or presumption rather, will expand our understandings of the sites, the actors, and the stories through which to understand people's conflict-related experiences, and it can shift our sense of what peace looks and feels like, who's involved in facilitating peace, and of how violence transforms people's lives. Great, thanks. In today's presentation, I want to share with you our plans and our dreams for this newly emerging research project and give you some ideas of what we think about or what we mean when we talk about love and care in times of conflict and violence. And we also want to share some ideas of what we imagine might be some of the ways in which these practices and these experiences play out in people's lives. And as I said before, I'm really looking forward and I'm really excited to hear what your thoughts and comments are, and to think alongside with all of you what this new imaginative research agenda might look like and where our collective curiosities will lead us in thinking about love and care in uncertain times. And the project is in many ways motivated by our and by my own omissions to pay sufficient attention to love and care in my research to date. As Dana has just said, for the past 10 years, I've worked quite extensively with conflict-affected communities in northern Uganda. And for my dissertation, as well as the current project, which I'm wrapping up, I've worked specifically with groups of male survivors of wartime sexual violence in Uganda, paying close attention to their experiences of vulnerabilities and harms, but also of agency and justice making. And this prior work is underpinned by different feminist analytical and methodological curiosities and a feminist commitment to the study of violence, peace, and survival. And part of such a feminist sensibility, as Cynthia Enloe teaches us, is to maintain the capacity to be surprised and to turn that surprise on ourselves, to critically reflect on what one has missed in one's own prior analysis of world politics over the years. And in our project, we want to take up Cynthia Enloe's invitation to be surprised and to turn that surprise on ourselves, and center that what past research on violence and conflict in general, including our own previous work on these topics, has not yet sufficiently enough engaged with, which are the importance, relations, and practices of love and care in context of armed conflict. In my prior work in northern Uganda, several interlocutors ranging from former rebel abductees or commanders to survivors and victims of sexual violence or peace-building practitioners at the local levels have regularly carried out the work of love and care and often narrated it to me. And throughout the course of my research so far, several such instances of loving and caring relations kept coming up and made themselves visible, even if I did not specifically ask about that or treated that as central in my own research today. To give you just one example, and there will be more to come, a woman abducted by the Lord's Resistance Army rebel group in northern Uganda explained to me how violence in the rebel ranks often coexists with experiences of commonality, of belonging, of loving and caring for each other, and how this is what kept her alive during this time of cruelty. Throughout scholarship on conflict and peace and practice as well, or policymaking, such narratives, experiences, and practice remain remarkably absent, however. These erasures then, I think, result in incomplete and often also very essentialist or very essentializing pictures of lived realities in times of conflict that remain overtly, if not even exclusively, focused on suffering, harm, and violence, which then forms the dominant script of research and scholarship on conflict and peace. And so by taking love and care seriously and by putting it at the center of our curiosities and our investigations with this new project, we want to seek to respond to emerging calls for scholars to move beyond what the indigenous scholar Eve Tuck has called damage-centered research, which focuses overwhelmingly on deprivation, violence, and pain. We also echo calls for moving beyond a singular focus on what the anthropologist Robbins has called the suffering subject, which often stands at the center of scholarly investigations and which often overshadows a focus on the good, such as hope, care, or love. To be clear, though, our intention is not to deny or to negate the importance of ongoing studies of harm and injustice, but rather to make the case for considering practices of love and care alongside experiences of violence, and to notice how such considerations can shift our understandings of violence and peace. We're also careful not to over-romanticize these relations and instead also try and recognize the ambiguity that love and care can at times also create or recreate different forms of suffering and violence. To move the PowerPoint one slide forward. Yeah, perfect. I do not want to bore you too much with theoretical and conceptual clarifications, but I think a brief understanding of what we mean when we talk about love and care, and also what we do not mean, might be helpful for us to take this forward. And we specifically think about love and care as active processes and relations, rather than as passive emotions or values. We're mindful not to put forward one sort of specific singular definition of what we mean by love and care, and instead try and seek to embrace the ambivalent characters of these concepts, because our analysis will ultimately be guided by the meanings and the interpretations that our research interlocutors attach to them and how they define them in often very locally specific or context-specific ways. There are, however, a number of different frames from across different literatures that we draw on to try and make sense of that. And in terms of love, you can see the cover of the book by bell hooks here, which we take much inspiration and guidance from. Bell hooks' works provide a key interpretive frame for us in terms of thinking about love, understanding love as an active verb and a set of interactive processes, actions, and practices which are embedded in interrelationships and interdependencies. And according to Hooks, love is composed of all sorts of different ingredients, including care, affection, recognition, respect, trust, or commitment. Quite importantly, I think we try and understand love not in a narrow sense, in romantic and sexual terms within heterosexual relationships or matrices, as it's often the case, I think, but instead focus broadly on different forms of different recipients of love, such as love for community, for place, for friendship, for political work, or for ecosystems, and much, much more. In terms of care, we're less focused on the formal and professional work of caregiving specialists or professionals such as nurses or medical professionals, and instead are more attuned to the everyday relations of care, including their political dimensions as practiced by those who do not necessarily have a family-related or professional mandate to provide care. Feminist care ethics scholar John Tronto puts forward a definition of care that I find particularly helpful, which refers to care as everything that we do to maintain, continue, and repair our world so that we can live in it as well as possible. And so as such, both love and care are underpinned by relationalities and by interdependencies, and should ideally be understood not only as emotions or values, although they certainly also are, but also as holding the potential to be practices which are put in action in different manifestations at different points in time. Also, while this focus on love and care as an expression is pretty clunky, I think, and maybe a mouthful sometimes, it also sometimes I think seems to suggest lots of similarities, and lots of scholars have indeed remarked that love and care can, in theory and practice, not necessarily be separated. We don't fully agree with that, I think. We're mindful to not treat them as synonymous and instead acknowledge their ambiguous and at times maybe even contradictory dimensions, which I'm sure is something we can refer to back in the discussion. But I think in my view, there can be care without love, and there can be declarations of love or expressions of love, at least, without any genuine care involved. Now, as I've mentioned earlier, in scholarship on conflict and peace, considerations for love and care remain mostly absent, or at the very margins, at the very least. This is in part, I speculate, because love and care are often treated or considered as being too personal, too mysterious to be subjects of scholarly inquiry, and regarded as feminine values, relegated to the personal domain, and therefore outside the realm of what much academic scholarship on world politics considered relevant to examine. The poet Pedro Otuma, whose podcast, Poetry Unbound, I absolutely adore and absolutely recommend everyone who likes poetry or would like to get into poetry more, has noted that love is one of the most difficult things to do in human community, but yet in politics and conflict resolution, love is often left out of the conversation because it seems airy-fairy or impossible. All of this is not to suggest, however, that there are no ongoing debates or discussions about love and care across different bodies of interdisciplinary scholarship. And there are indeed areas of resistance to these broader and wider exclusions, which inform our own thinking about these topics. And we thereby fully, and we're mindful to do that always when we sort of engage with this work, we fully recognize that with our particular focus and our intended contributions, we are situated squarely in existing communities of thought, of practice, and of relations, rather than fetishizing our own innovations, as we're often expected to do when writing about this, particularly so when crafting the grant proposal, of having to highlight all the innovative and groundbreaking stuff of that, which I'm sure some of it might be in there, but often I think takes it a notch too far and excludes these existing discussions that there are in which we embed this kind of work. And so our work is particularly informed by discussions about emotions in international relations, by feminist philosophy on an ethics of care, by work on an anthropology of love, but also indigenous scholarship on care in the Anthropocene. In international relations in particular, there has recently been growing attention to affect and emotions to expand the vocabularies with which scholars can explore different dimensions of world politics. Much of this work on emotions in global politics, however, is focused on certain actors and their emotions, such as heads of states, and is focused predominantly on certain types of emotions, such as anger, humiliation, shame, or fear. Yet there often is an avoidance of love across this literature. Now, you might be wondering why there's a album cover of Tina Turner's "What's Love Got to Do with This" on this slide, which is pretty much the question we ask ourselves: what does love have to do with all of this? But she would sing in that song, "Love is nothing but a secondhand emotion" in all of these debates. Our exploration is then also guided by thinking about the feminist ethics of care, which has recently developed as an alternative feminist moral framework in contrast to much of the dominant liberal individualism approach. An ethics of care views people as relational, connected, interdependent, and inherently vulnerable, thereby recognizing the moral value and importance of relations. More recently, scholars have increasingly tried or began to apply insights from care ethics to the domain of international politics and to a lesser degree also to questions of armed conflict, noting, for instance, how care cuts through social practices in all contexts and dimensions of peace and conflict. Lastly, then, we also immerse our exploration in anthropological and sociological scholarship on love, which has begun to pay attention to how discourses, sentiments, and practices of love manifest in daily lives and how they shape the ways in which people make sense of themselves and their relationships more broadly. However, we find that in some of this work, love is often treated as either a concept of material loyalty and or romantic as well as sexual notions of love in these heterosexual kinship or marriage relations are often what sort of fills the frame and is at the center of investigations here. In many ways, of course, such a focus on intimacy is important to illuminate the range of manifestations of love and desire, but it is important not to reduce intimate and affective relations to sex or romance only, and instead recognize all of the other dimensions of relationality that can emerge through intimate encounters. All of these conceptual and interpretive frames and this engagement with existing literature on love and care across different disciplines then will guide our ongoing and future explorations of experiences of love and care in the lives of conflict-affected communities. And in our project, we will be focusing specifically on Uganda and on Colombia, both as sites in which Roxani and myself have previously worked and thus have profound existing relationships and networks with different groups of interlocutors. And it's also the spaces in which friends, colleagues, research collaborators, and participants have already begun to tell us instances and examples of love and care, or where we have begun to notice them ourselves, which, as I said before, is sort of the origin story of the rationale of how this project came about in the first place. Now, for the rest of this presentation, I want us to explore what centering and love and care in context of peace and conflict would practically and empirically look like, where exactly we can explore these relations and what they can tell us about conflict-affected communities' experiences, as well as the ways in which they make sense of violence and see to remake a world in the ways. And these are just a few sort of illustrative examples of some of our emergent work, and there would be, I think, more to explore. And in the discussion in the Q&A, I'd be particularly excited or interested to hear your examples, if you have any, or your thoughts of how this may play out and show up for us then to collectively dream about what such a research agenda of taking love and care seriously could look like. And there's three aspects in particular where loving and caring relations play crucial roles in the narratives of our research participants that I came to notice and that I want to share sort of as illustrative examples here. One refers to the coexistence of harm and violence with love and care within particular situations or encounters and relationships. The other aspect refers to some of the specific sites and the different spaces or places in which these practices may materialize, offering some more maybe concrete and maybe even practical reflections of how this can look like. And then lastly, I want to share some emerging thoughts about love and care for and in more than human relations and elements. And in imagining this research agenda, I think it's important to emphasize and to recognize that during armed conflict and in its wake, practices of love and care often sit alongside shared experiences of violence and harm, rather than them being an exception or an alternative to it. People's lives always hold multiple truths, maybe even more so in times of insecurity and instability, and they are rarely ever characterized by only experiences of violence and suffering or only experiences of love and care. but instead by their coexistence and by the multiplicities of both and many, many more. And one particular context in which this may become particularly visible is that of rebel groups, and in the context of my own work, that of the Lord's Resistance Army rebel group in northern Uganda specifically. On the picture here, you can see a group of formerly abducted women and ex-forced wives in northern Uganda. Over the years, or the decades even, the past body of scholarship has documented that lived realities and relations within the LRA are largely defined and structured by violence, cruelty, and suffering, often directed outside against the civilian population, but also internally within the rebel ranks and among recruits in the forms of, for instance, abductions, beatings, torture, killings, or sexual and gender-based violence. However, rather than only being defined by cruelty and violence, relations within the LRA also involve different forms of practices of support, care, and indeed compassion between abductees and recruits. Feminist anthropologist Chris Coulter has previously noted, with reference to Sierra Leone, that everyday rebel life, despite the violence and the abuse, still has had many similarities with traditional pre-war life, something that certainly also applies to the context of northern Uganda here. One former abductee, for instance, explained to me that she would compare the environment in the bush to that at home. Yes, there's violence and brutality, but there's also commonality and caring for each other. Describing relations between young women and girls in the LRA, one former forced wife similarly shared with me that we were all living under the same roof. And between us wives, we would always help one another in a situation of sickness, delivery, or when taking care of the baby or nursing after delivery. That is how we took care of each other. And in these situations, we were sometimes even full of joy, happiness, and care. And these aspects of joy, happiness, commonality, love, or care for and between one another, I think is often also what played a crucial role and helped these women to survive under these otherwise very gruesome circumstances. Yet, of course, we ought to be careful not to overtly romanticize these experiences and relations, which were not always and exclusively supportive or cathartic, but were also often very hostile and the cause of much suffering and harm. And indeed, oftentimes it was those exact relations between abductees or between forced wives that were at the same time also a source of much suffering and abuse or cruelty. One woman who was abducted and forced to marry a commander in captivity explained to me that there were too many quarrels in the bush, always quarrels and fighting, but was really the worst between the other wives who always fought me and picked on me all the time. Similarly, the narrative account of life within the LRA by Evelyn Amoyne, who was forced to marry the LRA top commander Joseph Kony, offers very insightful examples of this potential coexistence of love, care, and violence within one particular relationships. Evelyn recounts several examples of these tensions and these hostilities between her and other abductees, but also between her and how her relationship with Kony was at once full of violence, but at times also of love and care between the two of them. For instance, she recounts a story from just a couple of months after she was abducted, when Kony ordered a boy to beat her as a form of punishment, I think, for having spilled a cup of sugar or some other food items, up to a point until she lost consciousness. The same boy who inflicted the pain on her is then ordered, again by Kony, the LRA top commander, to carry her and nurse her, attending to her wounds, as both of them cry together in desperation and pain. And so while violence, suffering, love, and care can coexist over longer time horizons, some of the more general examples have tried to show, this particular example, I think, also specifically illuminates the simultaneity of violence and care within one specific event in one particular relationship, illustrating the often complex and ambivalent web of social relations beyond any universalizing and violence-centric storyline. And I think considering this coexistence is pretty important for how we think about violence, harm, and care in such contexts and situations. Focusing only on the love and care would risk over-romanticizing these relations, while focusing only on the violence, as it's often the case, risks eliding all of these moments and practices of care that did enable some of these women and some of these people to survive under these very violent circumstances. And so this dual focus of taking both into account and holding both of these truths in our hand is important, because as Eve Tuck writes in her call to move beyond damage-centered research, it more accurately and more closely matches the experiences of people who at different points in time in a single day reproduce, resist, are complicit in, rage against, celebrate, and withdraw in uneven social structures, acknowledging all of these multiple and at times seemingly contradictory truths all at once. Another concrete site where we can observe the roles of love and care refers to survivors association, which take on prominent roles in Uganda, as well as in other conflict-affected settings globally. And in Uganda, I've worked specifically for several years now with male survivors of sexual violence, as you've said before, who are members of a survivors association called the Men of Courage, as you can see in the picture here. And in these groups, survivors engage in different types of storytelling activities, peer-to-peer counseling support, or different income-generating activities. And some of the survivors have discussed and described these spaces and these sites through the language of compassion, care, and love. For instance, one survivor explained that in the groups, we're always there for one another. We support our fellow members with compassion and care. To offer you an illustration of what some of that may look like, during one of the group settings, which I was able to attend in, I think, 2016, survivors supported one another and cared for one another emotionally. For instance, when engaging with prior experiences of violence and talking about that and narrating their stories. One of the survivors explained to me that when we meet and sit together, we can talk freely about what happened to us because everyone understands. We always take care of each other, especially so when we're struggling. In a different meeting, another survivor shared with the group that he urgently needed some money for his share of the funeral costs of the cousin of his who just recently passed away. And in support, several of the members immediately chipped in their own scarce resources, thereby taking care of each other's financial needs in that particular context. And so in this context, taking care of one another can extend from emotional to material support, and importantly, is rooted within these genuine and long-lasting relationships amongst survivors shaped by affection, recognition, trust, and commitment as key ingredients of love and care, as Bell Hooks would teach us. Groups can therefore represent, I think, a caring space which inspires or can inspire new effective connections and empowers participants by reinforcing feelings of belonging, identity, and dignity. As one of the survivors has put it, I found another family to live with, and those are the survivors in the groups. We started showing love and care to our peers, and today we are strong as a team, or even like a family because of our support. And so in many ways, I think these spaces can be understood as caring communities that enable survivors of violence to engage with their experiences, remedy harm, and in the process, maybe even facilitate a sense of justice-making, resilience, or agency. To wrap this up then, I want to offer some final thought for potential future explorations that we find particularly exciting, specifically focused on practices of love and care for and among more than human elements. Critical writing across different disciplines in feminist geography, indigenous scholarship, or ecology, for instance, reminds us of the interconnectedness of all living things and recognizes mutual bonds of relationality between societal, environmental, and spiritual worlds, for instance. Wider ecosystems of land, nature, plant, and animal life, and the spiritual world, for instance, must themselves be viewed as interconnected organisms that can practice and enact care, mutuality, and reciprocity, as the forest ecologist Suzanne Zimmer teaches us, for instance. In times of conflict, then, animal and plant life, for instance, often carry the scars of violence for generations to come, and therefore require different forms of care and compassion to engage with these lasting effects. At the same time, relations to land, place, culture, and much more often forms an integral backdrop of how people make sense of and endure experiences of violence and how they seek to remake worlds in the aftermath of it. For instance, interlocutors in northern Uganda have shared with me how their relations to and the care for their ancestral land, where their family members have been buried for generations and where their identities are firmly anchored, is what motivated them to endure and survive life in the IDP camp and to return home after displacement as soon as possible. Others have explained to me how remaking a world in the wake of violence for them often involves appeasing and taking care of the spirits through different kinds of rituals, and how in turn then the spirits and the ancestors which live through these spirits protect them and take care of them in the midst of various forms of hardship or insecurity and suffering. For instance, through the spirits bringing rain or blessing the harvest, therefore, contributing to their survival in difficult and tough times. And all of these examples and many, many more, I think, illustrate that relations of love and care in the midst and in the wake of conflict are not necessarily restricted to human interactions, but instead extend to more than human worlds and elements as well, with important implications for the range of practices that we associate with transcending violence, facilitating peace, and crafting a future. To conclude all of this, then, a research agenda on love and care, as I have tried to sketch it out here, would benefit greatly from taking all of these dimensions and more into account. Paying attention to all of these dynamics opens up possibilities, I think, to paint more careful and accurate pictures of the lived realities and the processes of remaking world in the midst of violence. Fittingly, as Maria della Bella Casa reminds us, the term accurate here derives from the word care. Prepared with care, exact, whereby doing something with care led to that of being exact. As such, taking love and care seriously renders visible multiple truths, practices, relations, dilemmas, and tensions that are attentive to the complex, intertwined, and often also unruly dimensions of violence, conflict, and peace. Investigating these processes and centering them in our analysis can shed important light on the relationships, practices, processes, and structures that enable people to imagine and reenact processes of remaking a world in the wake of violence. In more practical ways, then, taking love and care seriously also carries the potential to craft more careful policies and programs in post-conflict and transitional settings, which imply the potential to move beyond individualistic and neoliberal approaches, which I think is what often dominates many of these policies and programs and approaches, and which instead take into account the relationalities, the vulnerabilities, and the interdependencies of lived experiences in times of conflict more broadly. I'm going to wrap this up here, and I'm really looking forward to your comments, Anna, and then to the discussion and the questions that you have, and the debate that we'll have collectively. Thank you so much so far.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm actually, very honored and happy to be here and to have here this freedom to pick up the discussion. I was actually very happy to read the article, and I also recommend it to everybody here in the room because it is very accessible and very rich. Like it has, you and your colleague have worked on different contexts, so I think empirically it is very, very interesting. And in general, like the first thoughts I had, it's like with regards to the scholarly approach that is very important also for us at Gender and Peace Building, which is resettling the more traditional studies of war and violence, and in particular shed light on the micro level, the everyday. And hereby really working on a core feminist approach that is proposing to give a different kind of war stories. And at the Basel Peace Forum now just recently, we had a panel on feminist activism and network public spheres with our colleagues, scholar Tigis Tosin, who was working on Ethiopia and Tigray, and Ataf Al-Wazir, who was giving insights into Yemen. And there we also came to this conclusion of the importance of sharing everyday stories of resistance to war, and documenting very, as you also say in the article, different set of stories. And my colleague Ataf Al-Wazir spoke about the way people would also take care of themselves or also use art as an expression of care work. And I remember in 2014, she was sending me a WhatsApp picture. She was in Sana, and there was already bombardments, and she sent me a picture of them with the family in the cellar, in the shelter, all dressed up and with makeup on, and just also to remind me and say and everybody, like as a way, this can be a way to care, of love, and of showing a different image of war. So that's why I think this resonated very much with what you're researching. And yeah, let me have then the second recommendation here. That's her TEDx talk, actually, where she explains the different side of Yemenese war, where she gives ideas here and also points out the ambivalences and these coexistences of love and care in conflict settings that you also pointed out. And it's of course very important, because at first, like, you do want to give the whole picture, you don't want to romanticize the same, but on the other hand, you also especially in war and conflict research, the focus was very often only also on states and their interactions, and then maybe pictures of suffering civilians. So these were like the first examples that came into my mind when I read your question of how does taking the practices of love and care seriously illuminate different pathways for understanding the remaking of worlds in the wake of violence. And I also like the expression and the remaking of worlds. And maybe still like relating to this discussions we had with regards to network publics, and maybe for you also a question of how can we remake these worlds. I would like deduce the question of how can solidarities on social media be created on these possibilities to draw, exchange, archive, and helps and paint different pictures as a part of remaking the worlds. Yeah, this is like first, I don't know, question or discussion also for everybody. And a second point I would like to make with regards to the ethics of care, you're distinguishing, you're drawing from three bodies of scholarship that you named: emotions and IR, anthropology of love, and the ethics of care, where you make the point that there is, in this growing field of peace and conflict studies, there has not been a sufficient engagement yet with care. And I really like the argument, care is political work, but also the political work requires the work of care, and that is crucial, I think. And this makes me think of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda and the political participation of people, mostly women who are doing the care work, how this can be regarded as a barrier to their political participation. So this additional, often unnoticed labor needs to be thought into when we design any kind of program. Yes, so this is, and in the framework of the project of the Women, Peace and Security Alliance that we have at swisspeace, as well with consulting with different civil society organizations in Switzerland, they actually brought up this topic of care. And this is my third recommendation, their publication called No Care, No Peace, where they formulated demands, from within the civil society, drawing on qualitative interviews with Swiss NGOs, but also civil, academia and experts in the field. So that is, I think, pretty interesting. And I think the main question here is how socioeconomic barriers and care work in particular hinder women's participation in political and peace processes. And another recommendation, I think, there you would also agree, it's important to strengthen the scholarship in the field of care work, care economies, in particular with regards to conflict analysis as well. Another point, I'm running out of time already, is in the discussion of ethics of care. I find it also helpful to look at the contributions from BPOC discussions on self-care by activists and social justice activists as a way to continue and to pursue counter-resistance strategies, radical politics. In that regard, also, I liked how you did it also yourself in the article. So really, it's interesting to read it. Caring when writing, giving credit is another interesting aspect with regards to care and ethics of care. And then the word of caution with regards, especially this relates to our work, that there's always this gendered notions of love and care. So it's always women who care. And I find it interesting that you bring this example of male survivors and how they care also for each other. So there's also another whole work that needs to be done with regards to masculinities and caring masculinities. Yeah, so then from our perspective, from my perspective, in the practitioner's language, I found it important how the language with regards to memory and transformation, you make the point that the language of healing and recovery, when we're talking about care, we're talking also about maybe healing. And the discussion on memory and transformation, dealing with the past, transitional justice, you name it, is also opens this question of what should heal and who should be responsible for the healing process. And also, it's not so much in the presentation you gave us now, but again, in the paper, I really like how when we really look at love and care, how the question of intergenerational trauma also unfolds, and the question how can care and love come in here. So the same is true for questions of temporalities. The same ideas like with memory and transformation. There also the article offers different interesting insights. The question of in the wake, as you also have in the presentation, captures this question of intergenerational trauma, again, of war and conflict. Who decides when a conflict stopped and there is no care work anymore to be done? So yeah, all of these questions I find very important, also from the perspective of the feminist IR, of course, where the war on women, quote unquote, and patriarchal violence in domestic spaces is regarded as part of a continuum of violence, regardless of violent conflict. So last but not least, because I also want to give the space for the public and Q&A, when we talk about the overall implications of the discussion and scholarship on love and care in general on peace building initiatives and the analysis of fragility of states, etc., you make the point, also you made it now at the end, that programs and policies need to be adapted in light of the examinations of love and care, because we have like a clearer picture, which makes absolutely sense. Because one key factor undermining the peace building initiatives that we see now is that we really go from top and like kind of implement global norms, and often do not see the systems of care on the ground. And I would share with you for discussion this recent changes in the OECD criteria of fragility, where fragility defines as also takes in human as a dimension to analyze fragility, and as the combination of exposure to risk and insufficient coping capacity of the state, system, and or communities to manage, absorb, or mitigate the risks. So human is then, besides political, economic, environmental vulnerabilities, and new vulnerability, dimension of vulnerability. This only happened last year. So I wonder if this human dimension really already is an interesting step towards bringing in this perspective of love and care. Maybe one step there. But certainly, we are not there yet to actually capture the power of love and care to resolve and mitigate conflicts from below. But that is also a question which I would end, is the question of if we understood these local systems of care and love, how fragile are they? And you talked about we would have to think about beyond a neoliberal system, right? Mm-hmm. To see what are the different values that can be brought into these systems. So if we have an intervention from outside or money, what is the impact on these systems of law? Mm-hmm. And I would leave it here, though I have, of course, much more observations. But thank you very much, Philipp.
Thank you, Anna. Would you like to have some short reactions to this, and then we open the floor?
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah, if you don't mind.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Anna, for these comments and this really generous engagement with the article and the presentation. I maybe should have mentioned that before, that the project and the ideas and the presentation are also based on an article that Roxani and I wrote that came out last year, which you had the pleasure, or I don't know, the responsibility,
recommended it to the room,
the task of reading. But if you're interested to learn more about that, there's a longer version of what I've given you now with more examples. But yeah, I mean, there's so much of what you said that resonates profoundly with some of the questions we've asked ourselves and some of the thinking that we do to sort of take this forward. I'll maybe try and take out a couple that come to mind immediately, and then, as you said, we can revisit them, I'm sure, as part of the discussion that we'll have. One of the things you mentioned that we find particularly interesting and relevant is this idea of taking care of ourselves and ideas of self-care, especially so inspired maybe by feminist scholars and feminists of colors in particular. One of the things we want to do for this project, which is due to start in June, is to not only direct our curiosity and our scholarly gaze outwards to go and study love and care out there in the global south, but also to look at the different ways in which love and care and loving and caring relations play a role in the scholarship that we do and in the academy in particular, and where are the different sites and what are the different examples of how people within academia and practice, and maybe particularly so in peace and conflict studies, take care of themselves, take care of others, do care work for students, for staff. Who is it who does that care work? And I think you've already given us the answer that there's a very strongly gendered imbalance to who's expected to do that kind of work, who's then assigned to do that work, and where resources for other kind of work are taken away from. But also to acknowledge, and this is something I think that came out of both of our lives in the last year or so, to recognize that doing this work on conflict and peace and engaging with oftentimes really difficult stories, while at the same time in our lives, again, holding multiple truths at once, doing different kinds of care work, either at work or also at home, and what the implications of that are for our kind of work. When we think about, we briefly spoke about positionalities, like, for instance, what does it mean to me when I sit there at my desk and listen to a transcription of an interview with a male survivor, and then my daughter comes in and asks me if I can read Pippi Longstocking for her? Like, how can I navigate both of these truths at once and study violence and then also practice care, in a very different environment, but both at the same time? That's something that we want to do in the project, and we're not yet exactly sure what that would look like, but I think we're envisioning, for instance, a workshop where we'll explore some of that collectively. So that's something that you guys find interesting, then reach out to us and we'll keep that in mind. But I think that's a dimension for us that's particularly interesting. And also maybe to try and think about a better way of labeling that as self-care, which also often has these very neoliberal touch. You run yourself a bubble bath and you put on a light, you light a candle and you eat some pralines and listen to a nice podcast, and then you take care of yourself. And all of these structural inequalities and problems are suddenly just, disappearing through these very commercialized actions. That's not how it works. And as you said, feminists of color, scholarship of feminists of color have, I think, offered some really nice ways of community care, where we take care of ourselves collectively rather than individually, as I just take care of myself and disregard all of the other stuff. So yeah, that resonates profoundly with what we want to do there. And I think it also speaks to some of these inequalities that you said, and the the different socioeconomic barriers and responsibilities for care work, which then often in the academy maybe take away space and time for other resources or for political work in a different kind of settings. And yeah, these questions, as you said, who is expected to do care work? Roxani's interlocutors in Colombia, for instance, have shared with her, and that's in the article as well, how, they as women combatants get asked about love and care by her and maybe also by others, but none of the male commanders would ever be asked where he finds love or practices care. So the assumption by people who sort of study that is often already, we look for these practices in very feminine dominated areas. And we of course need to broaden our approach to that. Pairing masculinities, ties to that as well a little bit, is I think a fascinating field, which I'm just sort of dipping my toes into. And there's quite an exciting body of literature, which I think engages with that. And I'm eager to learn more about that, but can't say much more about this at this point, but I think it ties in with some of these bits. And then one last bit before maybe we can open this up. But I, like you also, or we both really like this term, this concept of remaking worlds, which is why I've repeated that over and over and over again as an, I think, alternative. So in using that, we rely on Veena Das and her colleagues who have coined this term, I think, more than 2 decades ago or so, as an alternative, I think, to some of the language around social repair or transitional justice or healing or recovery, which has not only very normative connotations, but also often a very, strong assumptions of linearity, that we do something and then we get from, something that is broken to having it repaired, or from something that is damaged to it being recovered, for us to be healed, which doesn't capture the lived realities of how that kind of stuff works. I think, on the ground, it rarely ever is a process from I'm this and then I do these steps and I get there, but it's, often goes back and forth, maybe doesn't lead anywhere for a long period of time. And so I think this idea of remaking worlds, it doesn't assume a particular endpoint where we get to, where a particular status quo is maybe repaired, but it has a certain sort of openness and flexibility, I think, to take into account all of these dimensions and all of these experiences, which is why we rely so heavily on it. There's more the policy implications in particular. I'm going to sit with that for a little bit and think about that, because it's also not, something that you would ask me. So what would be a policy implication of that? What would a new policy, on responding to violence look like? I wouldn't be exactly sure. Victims groups might be one example where, we can see that play out. They're also not always sustainable. And I think they are, often we make them out to be more locally owned and sustainable and survivor driven than they actually are. So there comes the element of outside interference, of maybe placing some of these practices in there, and then what does that do to sort of these places? How fragile are these systems and processes? But I have to sit with that for a little bit more, I think, about that. But yeah, thank you so much. That was really helpful and exciting.